I'm Gary Franchi, Chief White House Correspondent for the Next News Network, reporting from inside the International Media Center at the NATO Summit in The Hague. Behind me, the summit is at full throttle. Camera crews, reporters, intelligence officers, all packed shoulder to shoulder, chasing a cascade of developments that could shape the future of global peace or war. Now, it's a bright and sunny day outside in The Hague, but don't let the calm skies fool you. The undercurrents of the summit are electric. President Trump began his day at the Royal Palace, waking as the guest of King Willem-Alexander and Queen Maxima. From there, he headed straight into diplomacy mode. Breakfast with the royals, then a private pull-aside meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. His motorcade rolled out of the palace grounds at 9:30 a.m., skirting past the International Criminal Court, the same ICC facing sanctions from the Trump administration. A few dozen onlookers lined the route, catching a glimpse of the beast through the trees, though the president himself was not visible. And by 9:41 a.m., the motorcade arrived at the World Forum, the venue for this NATO summit. And while the press didn't see the President Trump step out, he did make his presence known another way, posting online about the beautiful Netherlands, a great breakfast with the royals, and the critical talks ahead. Now, that was only the beginning. The real story was already moving. So, let's begin. And just before arriving, President Trump surprised reporters aboard Air Force One with a briefing. The big news? The Israeli military backed off a planned raid at the last moment, a move that Trump credits to the ceasefire that he brokered. Take a look.
Everything good. Israel, as you know, turned back. They didn't do that raid this morning, fortunately. That was a big thing. Appreciate it. They had a lot of planes going, and they were going to do something, and they didn't do it. We're happy about that. Very happy about that. So the ceasefire is very much in effect, and I think we're going to keep it there for a long time.
Did you speak? Now, that's not just diplomacy. That is control. Trump didn't just stop bombs from dropping. He kept the peace alive on the eve of this summit. And for how long? Well, that's what we're all here to find out. Now, in the same gaggle, President Trump dropped another bombshell, one that didn't explode but echoed a possible deal with Russia. Watch.
You know, I'd like to see a deal with Russia. As you know, Vladimir called me up. He said, "Can I help you with Iran?" I said, "No, I don't need help with Iran. I need help with you." And I hope we're going to be getting a deal done with Russia.
That is the Trump doctrine on full display. While NATO talks war, Trump talks deals. Peace through strength, peace through negotiation. And no one else here is even uttering the word deal. When asked about Zelensky, Trump didn't hesitate. His response, direct, grounded, and brutally honest. Watch.
Do you think you'll meet with Zelensky when you're there?
Yeah, probably. I'll see him. Yeah.
What would you say to him?
Say, how you doing? They're tough. He's in a tough situation. Should have never been there.
Should never have been there. Trump cuts through the propaganda and reminds the world that this war should never have started. He's not here to coddle. He is here to course correct. And when Trump finally landed, the first thing he did was put on that unmistakable USA hat. Watch that moment. No speech, no teleprompter, just that red, white, and blue cap, a symbol of American grit. And Trump arrives as the embodiment of America first, and everyone at this summit saw it. Then came the family photo, the traditional show of unity. Trump center stage, flanked by Erdogan, while Zelensky finally swapped out his war clothes for a proper suit. Watch.
That's not allowed. You know it.
Can we take photos for the president?
Nope.
These aren't official.
They're posed.
Donald Trump looked like the quarterback of the free world. Zelensky, well, he looked like a man who finally read the room. And meanwhile, Trump's NATO ambassador, Matthew Whitaker, was already laying down the administration's biggest demand, 5% GDP defense spending from every NATO member. Take a look at this.
Tomorrow, we expect that all 32 NATO allies will agree to a new path. And that path, that commitment, is going to be 5% of their GDP on defense. And, you know, it is historic. It is probably one of the biggest foreign policy wins of this administration, of any administration. And then we're going to spend the time building out the capacity and the capabilities of the United States, and especially our allies here in Europe, so that they can take over the traditional defense of the European continent and allow the United States to address the challenges that we face globally from our adversaries. But at the same time, you know, our allies want to be part of this alliance with the United States. Yeah. And we at the same time need to address all of our security challenges. And so that's why we're looking for this commitment. That's why our allies are going to deliver this commitment, because it's not just about what the United States want. Ultimately, it's what they need as well. It's what their not only economies, but their societies demand. They want security, and they have to step up. For too long, Europe has been taking advantage of the American taxpayer to provide their traditional security here on the continent, and it's just that time is over. President Trump's been very clear about that, and this is the moment where they are finally going to commit to doing that. Presidents since Eisenhower have been telling Europe they need to take over their own security. And so President Trump has delivered that. But that's a familiar refrain, whether it's the nuclear program of Iran or so many other things. President Trump delivers what these promises that politicians of the past couldn't deliver.
Now, that's not a goal. That's an ultimatum. And Whitaker wasn't bluffing. Trump has done what no president before him could do, force NATO to pay up and step up. Even NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte had to give credit where it's due. This isn't just a policy shift, it's a quantum leap in collective defense. Watch.
So we now know exactly what forces, resources and capabilities each ally needs to provide. This will require a quantum leap in our collective defense. But I know that when there is a will, our world-class industries and entrepreneurs will find a way. This will also require bold decisions from our political leaders. And that's what we will do at the summit tomorrow, with an ambitious new defense investment plan to spend 5% of GDP for defense. This will mean a huge defense dividend, an engine of growth for our economies, driving literally millions of jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. NATO's leaders are about to take an historic step to provide the resources necessary for strong defense. And now it's up to industry to deliver, and yes, to deliver. So let's get to work.
Millions of jobs, trillions in spending. But is it peace or just more fuel for the war machine? Then, at dinner, he said it out loud. NATO has already added $1 trillion in defense spending over the last decade, and the person he credits for that? President Trump. Watch.
It will also be a massive achievement in making NATO fairer. For decades, the United States sought to get Europe to truly step up. Now, European allies and Canada will equalize their defense spending with the United States. So let me salute President Trump's long-standing leadership in calling for NATO to increase defense spending. Today, I am pleased to announce that NATO has already added an additional $1 trillion in defense spending over the past decade. Mr. President, dear Donald, that is thanks to you pushing us. And tomorrow we will build on that foundation and add trillions more in defense spending, because we need to do this.
Now, you saw it right there. He saluted Trump from the podium, and that should tell you everything. Trump isn't a disruptor here. He is the architect of this moment. Now, back home, CNN is still doing CNN things. Aaron Burnett described Iranians chanting death to America as friendly. Watch.
Israel stays in place, and that is part of the discussion, right? Yes, absolutely part of the discussion. And, you know, I remember, Dan, at one point being in Tehran years ago, and they're chanting death to America all around me, even as I say, oh, I'm an American reporting for CNN, and they were happy to speak to me. So that those two sort of jarring realities of the chant and yet the friendliness have existed together. But I am hearing from some in Iran that I have not heard this from before, a sense of deep uncertainty about the future and of what happens next, and also of what the role is of the supreme leader. Now, we've heard that he's 86. We know his health has been ailing, but that in this moment, where everything that he has stood for and put Iran on the line for, which is giving up economic future, giving up so many bright stars who have left the country, all in the pursuit of a nuclear program designed to counter Israel, right? That all of that being put on the table has, for the first time from some, I have heard, what was all of this for? What was all of this for when the leaders, the religious leaders of this country have focused on things like women's hair and what they wore? So, you know, it's unclear how far things like that will go, how much of that is emotion in a moment that is exhausting and stressful and has meant a lot of failure for Iran, or how much of this is something bigger. But in the context of a regime change, the Ayatollah, the supreme leader, being in a bunker underneath Tehran, because he was at fear of his life when this deal was done, and perhaps being out of contact with the people who had to make the deal is something that, as we look back on this moment, may end up being a very significant reality that as the timeline plays out and we see where this goes, we look back and say, okay, that was something very important.
Now, that's what passes for analysis in the U.S. media. No wonder Trump has to do it himself. No one in the legacy press is telling the truth anymore. And, of course, it gets worse. CNN then published leaked top-secret battle damage assessments, compromising national security and undermining the mission. Watch.
About the battle damage that resulted from those U.S. military strikes on these 3 Iranian nuclear facilities over the weekend. And as you said, it was produced by the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the Pentagon's intelligence arm. And it is worth noting that it is a very early assessment. The strikes were only a matter of days ago, and the intelligence community is still gathering intelligence. They are still working to come up with a full, comprehensive picture of what exactly happened here. But based on a battle damage assessment that was carried out by U.S. Central Command, essentially looking at the images and looking at what was actually damaged, the Defense Intelligence Agency has assessed that the core components of Iran's nuclear program are largely intact, and that Iran's nuclear program has essentially only been set back by months. Now, we presented this information to the White House for comment, and White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt, she did acknowledge the existence of this assessment, but she said in a statement that the administration disagrees with it. She said, quote, "This alleged assessment is flat out wrong and was classified as top secret, but was still leaked to CNN by an anonymous low-level loser in the intelligence community. The leaking of this alleged assessment is a clear attempt to demean President Trump and discredit the brave fighter pilots who conducted a perfectly executed mission to obliterate Iran's nuclear program. Everyone knows what happens when you drop 14 30,000-pound bombs perfectly on their targets, total obliteration." Now, it is worth noting here that there has been dissent, I should say, within the intelligence community, within the defense community, about just how much of an impact these massive bunker buster bombs would actually have on Iran's nuclear facilities. It was far from certain, given that these bombs had never been tested in an actual combat scenario, whether they would actually penetrate those very, very deep underground tunnels that lie underneath these nuclear facilities. And what we are told is that as of now, this Defense Intelligence Agency assessment, it does conclude at this point, again, it is still very early, that those underground facilities, including the centrifuges, including the highly enriched uranium that everyone has been talking so much about, those are largely intact. Now, of course, this does stand at odds with what President Donald Trump and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth have been saying in recent days about the impact of these U.S. military strikes. Of course, President Trump said it was totally obliterated, and Secretary Hegseth did as well. And he actually also provided CNN with a statement And he said that, quote, based on everything we have seen, and I've seen it all, our bombing campaign obliterated Iran's ability to create nuclear weapons. Our massive bombs hit exactly the right spot at each target and worked perfectly. The impact of those bombs is buried under a mountain of rubble in Iran. So anyone who says the bombs were not devastating is just trying to undermine the president and the successful mission. Now, our sources did emphasize here that there was severe damage that was done largely to the above-ground structures at these nuclear sites. And so there was damage done, of course, by these massive bombs. But the core components of the nuclear program, we are told, they are largely intact, and it only set the program back by a matter of months.
They handed our enemies the blueprint for clicks. This wasn't journalism. It was sabotage. And Steve Witkoff, special envoy to the Middle East, he didn't mince words. He called it what it is, treason. Watch.
We're talking about with this leaked intel report.
Well, it goes without saying that leaking that type of information, whatever the information, whatever side it comes out on, is outrageous. It's treasonous. So it ought to be investigated, and whoever did it, whoever's responsible for it, should be held accountable. It could hurt lives in the future. Leaking is a completely unacceptable thing. But let me give you, because I've read all the damage assessment reports from not just our government, but from other governments. And I'm not going to get into anything that's top secret, but let me tell you for sure what happened here. There are three distinct facilities in Iran that we were concerned with. Isfahan, which is a conversion facility. You cannot weaponize unless you have what's called the conversion process at the beginning of enrichment, and then a conversion process to metallicize.
Now, he's right. This leak didn't just hurt diplomacy. It endangered American lives, and whoever did it must be held accountable. And finally, a moment of gratitude from the unlikeliest of places. Billboards across Syria saying, "Thank you, President Trump." Watch this.
That is now the 6th poster billboard that we have seen since arriving here thanking President Trump.
They're thanking him for lifting punishing sanctions and normalizing relations between the U.S. and Syria.
I love you, Trump. I love you, Trump.
In small letters in the right-hand corner, a Syrian-American lobby group, Global Justice, co-founded by Mesa Kabani.
I want to show you this one, which is after the liberation, it was our new slogan, "Make Syria Great Again."
When the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad fell, Kabani began shuttling back and forth from her home in Philadelphia to Damascus. She met with President Trump and Syria's new leader, Ahmed al-Shara, pushing for that historic meeting between the two presidents. For President Trump, she had her sales pitch ready.
I told him our new slogan is "Make Syria Great Again," and hopefully we're going to see Trump Tower in Damascus soon. So he was laughing. So I don't know. I felt that we can do it. And I feel that, this is the way how we're going to approach President Trump. His personality actually is different than any other president. And we need to talk to the people based on what they like to hear. And he likes to hear that.
The Middle East is watching, and they're saying 2 words: thank you. Why? Because Trump didn't just drop bombs, he opened doors. Now, this summit isn't just history in the making. It's Trump's doctrine in action. The ceasefire he brokered, still holding. The haters back home, still lying. And NATO, still moving in the direction that he demanded. Now, peace through strength isn't just a slogan. It's a strategy. And this is the battlefield of ideas. I'm Gary Franchi, reporting for the Next News Network, deep inside the NATO Summit grounds. We are your America First eyes and ears behind these gates. So stay sharp, stay bold, stand for peace, and keep watching, because we're not done yet.